Hey, Kate here from the Narrate team. How do you think about God's judgment? Why does it matter? As Adam steps into known truths that God is 100% grace and 100% truth, he explores the spectrum of beliefs that surround the topic of hell.
So, hi you guys, how are you doing? It's unseasonably cold, isn't it? Does it just feel like you spent yesterday cold all day? If not, that means you weren't helping us at the climbing gym yesterday, because we started in t-shirts and we ended freezing. It was the type of cold where you knew that your nose was just dripping continuously, but you stopped caring. That type of cold. Listen, if this is your first time or if you're here all the time, there's a couple things that we trip over purposely and often, and that is that there's really two things that we strive to do and do well, and that is gather and scatter. What we mean by gather is this. We like the opportunity this affords us to create experiences that are helpful and engaging no matter where you're at in your spiritual journey. If you're a Christ follower, we hope this is a launching pad, that it catapults you, that it realigns your thinking for the week, kind of like a chiropractor, only cheaper. And I don't know, that's maybe a bad joke, but because chiropractors aren't all, well, anyway. Okay, so I was going to say they're not all that expensive, but then that's relative too, isn't it? So now I've just created this giant tangent, and I should just shut up and keep talking, which I'll do. Anyway, we value this for a Christ follower. We also, for those of you that aren't sure what you're going to do with Jesus, or you're not quite following him yet, or not even sure if you ever will, we think this is a space where we can create conversation for life and marriage and work that's valuable, especially for you, even for you. And so that's the scattering piece, and then that's the gathering piece, and then there's the scattering piece, and by that we mean mattering. We feel like that our commission is to put the divine on display, to matter in such a way that if we cease to exist, the most ardent critic of Christianity would be bummed. Not necessarily because they've come to agree with our thinking about Jesus, though that would be great as well, but because they recognize the tangible impact. And so if you cut us, what we bleed is gathering and scattering. And the scattering thing, that happens organically, and part of what we're trying to do is validate, like, listen, you're already busy, you already have families, you already have jobs, you already have friends, you already have kids, you already have all these responsibilities, and so let's just be clear that this is the easy part of following Jesus, and those other 6 days are the hard part. And so there's validation to just putting a towel over our arm in our everyday lives, and then periodically we like to scatter together, and that we think is about compiling resources and energy and skills and mattering in those tangible ways. And so yesterday we did that. Thank you to those of you who had runny noses on our behalf. We scattered it. There's a local climbing gym starting up. If you've not seen about that, you should go to our Facebook page or website and you'll see their video. Really excellent thing for the community and students and families and climbers and everybody in between. So thanks for helping us pull nails from boards and sand boards and all kinds of things. That was fantastic. And what that segues us into is our next scattering event, which is Helena Ales for Trails, which is kind of weird. Like, some of you are whispering, like, seriously, beer in a church? Like, this is incongruent. It doesn't go together. And let me just be the first to say we get that. The tension here, it's not lost on me. It's not lost on the staff. It's not lost on the management team. And it's especially not lost on the council. Part of the win for us here is to demonstrate responsible consumption. We think oftentimes we just turn the microphone over to an abusive style and we go, no. There's an art called brewing, just like there's an art called making chocolate, and there's healthy ways and unhealthy ways to engage in that. But especially what we like about this event is the chance that it gives us to collaborate with local people on a topic that matters for everybody, which is Centennial Trail, and the way that it allows us to come alongside community members who aren't interested in Jesus and aren't a part of Narrate, but suddenly we have common ground. It's something we started, but we started it with some people, some small business people, some civic people, and that energy has just grown. Today, Ales is led by a consortium of people from all different kinds of places, some of whom are a part of this and some of whom aren't. And really what we're all trying to do is go, like, let's serve Helena, and let's create an experience that we think will raise 20,000 plus this year at the event for Centennial Trail, but also one that's affordable and accessible. You may have noticed that there's lots of great fundraisers out there, and a lot of them are really expensive, and that's fantastic. And our goal here is to go, let's create an experience that for that 20-something couple with kids and a new job, and they're struggling to do anything pleasurable with any extra money, let's create an experience for them where they leave having been treated like royalty. And they leave, and I've had these interactions where people go like, you could have charged way more. And we go, yep, because that's part of the win here. and also to create an experience where the vendors, they want to come back, and some friends have helped us create an experience where we have 18 breweries this year. That's not because those guys don't have lots and lots of opportunities. It's because thanks to you all and this community, we've created an experience that the word is out. Like, this is one of them that you want to be at and you want to get invited to. And many of those brewers that we've added this year, we didn't ask. Like, they came to us and said, like, seriously, can we be a part of this? So there's that element. And then we want to serve. We want to matter. We want people to leave going, weird. I thought I knew everything that I needed to understand about what it meant to be a Christ follower, and you guys have just messed with me. And the big win is on the day of the event. It'll take over 100 volunteers serving at this thing. And the great thing is about half of them will be Narrate people. And half of them will be people who have never been to Narrate, maybe never will. And you get to kind of serve side by side, whether it's pounding tent spikes or pouring or whatever it is. And suddenly, like, the world gets a little smaller, and we realize that, wow, wait a minute, we have as much in common as we don't. So would love for you to be a part of this. It's a huge part of the way we are telling God's story in our community. But let me say this. If you have an issue with alcohol, if you have an issue with substance, could I just be the first to say, like, stay away? Like, we have lots of scattering opportunities. This one isn't yours. Lots more coming down the pike even this summer. And so we get that. If you're not 21, stay away. Please stay away. But otherwise, we would love for you to serve with us. So there's a sign-up sheet out there. What we're asking for is your name and email, and then Sarah will email you a form, and you can kind of dialogue with her on the more specific details, because there are lots of them. There's also posters out there, which our interest really isn't to decorate your dorm room, not yet. But you know, if you want to take one to the conference room or something along those lines, and there's a place that you frequent that you'd love to put one up, go ahead and grab one of those. Speaking of trails, that's a mouthful. So last year I was saying that the worst thing is to come around a hairpin corner on a trail run and see what is certainly a black bear up in front of you, and after putting it in 100% reverse and like having not even pivoted yet, hearing an elderly woman screaming, "It's a dog! It's a dog!" So that was humiliating. This last Monday, I'm kind of on the fence about the whole don't fence me in 30K thing. And so this last Monday I was doing a run, and I went up over Ascension and was meeting a friend in the old archery range parking lot. But he's a musician, so he was 5 minutes late. And so just calling it like I see it. And so as I was coming down to that old archery range parking lot and I could see my friend wasn't there yet, I was just kind of looking up on the hillside, and I saw a tan-colored creature with a white chest region flittering about on the hillside. And at first I thought, it's a dog. It's a dog. It's a dog. Fool me once, right? It's a dog. And it was tan. And then I saw it, and first I was like, it's a dog, and then no runner appeared, and like stray dogs, like you don't just run into them in the Helena Trail system. I've never seen one, and so I was watching a little bit closer, and I could see it, and I couldn't, and I could see it had a curled tail. Like I've never seen a mountain lion, and I'm not a genius, but curled tail, that cues me off to something. And so I was getting my phone out actually, and I was literally thinking like, what do I do first? Do I text my friend Roy that I just saw my first mountain lion, or do I take a picture? And so as I was fumbling over my phone, Roy, I just want you to know I was thinking of you, I heard a woman's voice coming down from the spot that I had just came from, and she was headed to where I was heading. And so I thought, well, I need to, like, here's my chance to serve humanity and save a woman's life. And so I tried to get her attention, and was waiting for it first, and I assumed there were two because she was talking very loud. Turns out she was talking on her phone, like on her iPhone, and like, she was pretty hardcore, and she couldn't hear me because she's talking on her phone and running, and I was like, what's it like to be the guy on the other end of the line? But never mind, that's its own thing. And so I had to like run up and intersect her on the trail, and I was like, ma'am, excuse me, but there's a lion up there. She's like, there's a lion? Yeah. So she's like, show it to me. So we went back to the thing, and I'm pointing like, it's in that bush right there. See that bush? It's just kind of prowling around right there. And she finally, my friend still wasn't, she's like, what are you going to do? I was like, well, I'm waiting for my friend. Like, that's what I'm doing right now. Meanwhile, how am I rerouting my path? I don't know. I haven't decided yet. And she says, well, I'm just going to go. It'll scare away. I was like, did you have nuts and bolts for breakfast? Like, who is this woman? So she takes off, and she's going up those switchbacks up to the Rodney Ridge, and I'm thinking like I'm watching an episode of Shark Attack, right? Like, because I've not seen a lion. I know that if you see one, that's a bad sign. And so she gets just up into the region where the lion was, and sure enough, it came spraying out the side, like towards town, and it was on that wide open meadow, and she's gone, and now it's staring at me, just looking at me. And then I realized it's a dog. just a stray tan dog. So just in case you work with a woman that said she saw some idiot at the trailhead of Rodney, that would be me. And she has nuts and bolts for breakfast. You should know that as well. So this morning we're going to continue in this series that we've been in for a while called Seriously. And kind of gets a little more serious from here. But what we've talked about so far is the resurrection and why it's important and why that's such a big deal in Christian history. Last week we talked about heaven and life after death and life after death. Even heard comments of people going, yeah, it seems right that there's a bodily, like there's a physical afterlife, but I sure wish it wasn't true. So that creates its own conversation. This morning I want to talk about a topic that is incredibly serious, that's highly emotive, and every bit as controversial as anything you could ever talk about on a Sunday morning. The corollary to a conversation about heaven, and I think if we're going to be fair and have some integrity, the corollary is hell. It's God's judgment. And let me just say it kind of before we jump in, like you showed up with your opinions and I showed up with mine. Like hell isn't a topic, the afterlife, the judgment, all those kinds of things, Hades. Probably nobody sat down in the room and went like, boy, I've never thought about this. I don't have an opinion on this. We all do. And some of us even have verses to back up our opinions. And so if I could just kind of clear the air, my goal here this morning is not to tell you what I think. And it's also not to tell you necessarily what I think you should think. And quite frankly, though maybe somebody will question my motivation here, my goal is not even necessarily to argue what I think the Bible says. What I want to do here this morning is create a platform where I challenge you and invite you to think about how you think about God's judgment. This really the primary or the initial goal here is just to get you thinking about how do you think about this topic. Because some of you, you're lifelong Christ followers, and you would say, I believe in hell. In fact, I believe in an eternal, conscious hell because I believe in God's justice. And it's like, what do you say to that? Others of you would, and this is what makes it so complicated, you would take a different set of verses, maybe even the same verses, and you would say, I don't believe in hell because I believe in God's justice. Some of you are even deeper into the topic and you're more nuanced and you could even ask more specific questions. But to me, the tragedy of all of that is what we could easily miss is outside of this Christian continuum is another conversation, and probably just as many of you are here, especially those of you who don't follow Jesus. And for you, it's like, I don't even know where to start with Jesus because of what I understand Christians say about hell. And oftentimes they say it very smug with a smile on their face. I go to an art museum and I see medieval art, and quite frankly, it makes me question the whole thing. This morning, I just want to get you thinking. Because hell is a topic that I think we're intensely interested in, but we don't really like to talk about. It's something where a little bit, it goes a long way. And so really this morning, because we're a place that values conversations and questions, I just want to provoke you to think about how you think about this. Because even if it doesn't matter to you in your day-to-day life, it matters out there. And it is, maybe for you, maybe for someone you do life with, one of the central hang-ups of the entire Christian story. And to me, it's unfortunate that there's this general sense that we all agree on a topic, but the more you dig around, the more you realize we don't all agree on any of it. So here's what I want to do this morning. I'm indebted to Scott McKnight, who several years ago at a convocation did something that I thought was highly creative, and it's literally been in my plagiarism file for several years. And what I want to do is offer you a quiz that just gets you thinking about how you think about this. Now, it's not the type of quiz, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. I'm going to ask you 6 questions that identified or that help you identify with where you land right now. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. I'm not going to ask you to write it down. You don't have to share this with anybody. I promise I'm not going to do that like, hey, turn to your neighbor. You don't even have to tell your wife if you don't want, or your husband or whoever. But I just want to ask 6 questions that I know for me, when I heard this several years ago, it helped me begin to form some categories to this and help me understand what the issues are and what they really aren't. So number 1, maybe you identify with this view. Number 1, do you think a person must consciously respond to the overt offer in the message of Jesus in order to escape hell and go to heaven? Now, if that's what you believe, that would make you of the traditionalist view. The traditionalist view would say that a person has to literally respond to the gospel message as understood of Jesus and his death and grace and resurrection and all of it, or else they're going to hell. And in fact, if we're to be honest, the traditionalist view would say that if you haven't heard of the historic Christ, your odds of making it into heaven are very, very slim. Now, if that's what you think, then that would make you of the traditionalist view. But maybe that doesn't appeal to you. There's still another option. Number 2, do you think the wicked will experience judgment, but will then be extinguished from existence? This is very soft stuff, isn't it? If that's the way you think, that would make you of the annihilationist view. If you're an N.T. Wright guy, then you know that he talks about, that the way he talks about it is conditional immortality. It gets kind of nuanced. But what annihilationism ultimately says, if I could grossly oversimplify it, is that at death, those who responded to God's grace are ushered into his eternal presence, first non-physically, then physically on the new heaven and the new earth when those two things come together. And those who are outside of God's grace are ushered into a place of punishment, but ultimately that punishment extinguishes the person from existence. So where annihilationism is distinct from traditionalism is annihilationism says that hell is not an eternal, nor is it a conscious thing. Now, maybe neither of those appeal to you. Maybe number 3 appeals. Number 3, do you think that everyone will eventually be saved? Now, this would technically be called the universalist view, and to be fair, the universalist view had great following for the first 4 centuries of Christianity, then fell completely out of the conversation with Constantine, and in the 18th century has ramped up and is a very fast and to some troubling trend within current evangelicalism. What universalism says is that ultimately God's mercy and his desire for everyone to walk in relationship with him, which the scriptures are clear on, that it trumps a person's free will. And see, one of the ironies of the universalist view is you have to be of kind of a determinist, or lest we call it a Calvinist bent. Because ultimately what universalism is saying is you have people's free will and God's will, and to me this is somewhat ironic, but what universalism, really the way it works out practically, is it's saying God's mercy has more weight, God's will and his desires for people has more weight than their desires for themselves. Now, one of the things you have to consider on this one, and I'm not saying this persuasively, I just think it's honest, is that if this is where you fall, then you also have to reconcile the fact that Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and the worst of the worst are also in God's eternal presence. Now, maybe none of those 3 appeal to you. Here's a 4th. This is the wordiest. Do you believe that God judges a person on the basis of what that person heard or the light they've received, so that some will be in heaven even if they've never heard the name of Christ? Now, this would be what some would call the inclusivist view. And what the inclusivist view says, you've heard it probably maybe in different ways. Some would say you can know Jesus without knowing his name. That's what they're referring to. Some have said, like it's possible. I've heard one guy say that everybody who can handle being in heaven will be in heaven. That's another way to say it. But the big thing here is that the inclusivists are saying that you can't possibly hold the people in North Korea who have a very strong regime to keep them from ever even hearing of the historic Christ. You can't hold them accountable to that standard. But in fact, what happens is God gives some amount of light to every person who's ever lived, and thus they are held responsible for what they know of God and his grace. Inclusivist view would say there's a wideness to God's mercy. Now, maybe that doesn't capture things for you either. There's still a 5th option, and of course there's overlap. But number 5, do you believe that humans that have an opportunity to respond to God after death? This would be called second chance salvation, or post-mortem salvation view. I think this is what Rob Bell is hinting at in his book Love Wins, if you followed that whole deal. But it's not really his style to say what exactly he thinks. But here the issue here is, do you believe that in this life is the only chance you get, or do you believe that chance extends infinitely? See, what the post-mortem view would say is that beyond death, you continue to get the opportunity to respond to God's grace, whether you take it or leave it. If you're fascinated by this, I would really recommend C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Great Divorce. It's about 90 pages long. It's all fiction, and it's this fascinating, troubling, you'll throw it across the room kind of study. And I think he, too, is kind of hinting at a post-mortem sort of view. Now, the first 5, Though of course this is the way things work, Christians argue about, well, that's not Christian. Well, yeah, it is. No, it isn't. The first five they fall within the Christian spectrum. Obviously, not everyone would agree with all five of them, but they're distinctly Christian in some sense. There's one more option, and it's outside of that. Number 6 says this: do you believe that all religions ultimately lead to God, and do you think that all are adequate for salvation? Now, this, of course, would be the pluralist view. And the pluralist view would say that all religions are ultimately leading to the same God, and thus they're all leading to heaven. And really, pluralism, if we're to be honest from a scholarly standpoint, they don't talk much about hell because they don't believe in hell, and thus it doesn't really make any sense to develop ideas around a place you don't exist. I saw a bumper sticker recently, which sparked good conversation in our car, that the bumper sticker said, I'm going to hell according to every religion. And I thought, well, that's cute, but it's actually intellectually, like, no matter what you believe, it doesn't make sense, because not all spiritualities even believe in a hell. So there's that. And I think the big question here is, like, why does it matter? Because you're like me, you don't have theological problems, you have life problems, right? Like we don't need answers to pass a test, we need answers to pass a life and to thrive. And I had an interaction with a friend a couple months ago now, that for me, and I didn't realize it at the time, kind of encapsulated this whole conversation for me. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I got a text from a friend. This is a person who, in the last couple of years, has started following Jesus with us here at Narrate. She comes from a very mixed spiritual background. It's been really fun to watch her grow and thrive. And the text gave me some information, which I can't. It was short, but I can't give it to you as short as the text. Basically, what she said is, "Hey, Adam, could we meet this week? Because an individual in my family has died, and I've been asked to do their funeral." Now, I knew the individual, and I knew the story. The story of this individual, and I've asked her permission to allude to this, was that this was a man, a nephew of hers, a father in her family. Not, you know what I mean? He was a son. He was a grandson. And years ago, he had committed some, dare I say, pretty heinous crimes, and was paying for them. And quite honestly, the best they could tell, had never really actually ever shown any remorse for those crimes. And as if that weren't complicated enough, he committed suicide, and now she was being asked to conduct his funeral. See, her story is like some of yours, where she started following Jesus, and now she's like the go-to person in the family to pray. You know that? Like, hey, someone should pray before Thanksgiving. Will you pray? That kind of deal. Will you do the funeral? And when I read it, it kind of took my breath away. And I remember thinking to myself, I've been doing this for 15 years. This is a harder assignment than any assignment I've ever been given. Because, of course, the commission is stand in front of a group of people who knew him and knew the background and knew the story, who are of mixed opinions spiritually, and somehow honor and celebrate his life, while at the same time not saying things that everybody in the room knows is true, while at the same time having something intelligent to say about his eternal destiny. And as we sat down and worked it out, and listen, this was, for me, a conversation thing, not this like, ooh, this is easy. There were a few things I settled on. And I suppose if you pushed me in a corner, this is, I guess, the way I settle on the hell conversation. And it's first and foremost, and this is kind of the way even she worked through the funeral, to say, aren't there things that we know and things we don't? Even as Christ followers, aren't there things that we can claim to know? We still believe them, but we can cling to them. But aren't there things we don't? Like we know some things about God, especially if we're claiming Christ, don't we? Like we know his grace is vast. We know that it's like scandalously unpredictable. Maybe a good thing for you to do in your chair time over the next couple of weeks is read through the Gospel of Mark or one of the other Gospels and just remind yourself of the types of people who made up Jesus' followers and friends or disciples. That he didn't go to Carroll College and go, hey, let's talk to all the valedictorians. It's more akin to he went to the Lewis and Clark County jail and went, hey, anybody want to change the world with me? They were these people of very salty backgrounds. Like one of them that comes to mind for me is Mary Magdalene, who was this instrumental force in the early church, the first person to ever, as far as I can tell, interact with the resurrected Christ. And yet in the book of Luke, we're told how her story and where her story began. In Luke chapter 8, verse 2, it says, the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Now listen, you might go like, well, that's metaphor. I don't know what you believe there. I think it's literal, but whatever. But even if you think it's metaphor, like, what does 7 demons came out of tell you about her background? Kind of had a story, don't you think? Had some stuff, made some decisions, let some stuff into her heart. There was some major psychotherapy needed, if you know what I mean. And yet Jesus called her one of his closest confidants. There's another guy who, if he were alive today, like he would be cellmates with Bernie Madoff, among the worst of white-collar workers. His name was Zacchaeus. And listen to the way listen to what he did after he responded to Jesus' grace. He says, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times the amount. Now, how many of you, when you had your moment of salvation, went like, geez, I owe some people like 4 times. Like, I'm a thief. This guy was one of Jesus' friends. Peter, who we celebrate as the guy. Let's remind ourselves that he was the coward in the text. Like, you go looking for the biggest weakling in the New Testament, you're going to find Peter. It was Jesus, how you use Jesus to explain Peter's outcome, not Peter. Over and over and over again. And it raises this question, doesn't it? Do we explain who made up Jesus' followers by saying he's soft towards sin? Or do we explain it by going, hey, be careful about who you assume fits inside of God's grace and who he doesn't? Let's just be honest. We stand in front of a funeral and go, hey, let's just be clear on this. The guy qualified if he wanted to qualify. Another way to say it is we know that God is 100% grace and 100% truth, don't we? There's a story that we visit often. It's a story where a woman was caught in the act of adultery. She's brought to Jesus. The people bringing her are trying to trap Jesus because they want him dead. And so the story is the Jewish law said that she needs to be stoned to death, like not with a bong, but with a rock. And the culture said you can't do that. Like Rome said you don't have that authority anymore. And so they bring this woman to Jesus and they say, hey, what do you want us to do? You're trapped is what they're saying. And Jesus, I've been trying to work on this myself because when he felt himself trapped, rather than offer a stupid answer, he just started playing in the dirt. Like, just checks out. And eventually, shouldn't surprise us, essentially what he did is he asked a question. He says, tell you what, whoever of you is without sin, why don't you go ahead and throw the first rock? Whatcha? Right? Like, there's this game, and he's better at it. And eventually, everybody leaves. And remember Jesus, he stands up, and he says, woman, has no one condemned you? And she says, no one. No one, sir. And then listen to his response. He says, not, hey, don't sweat it. It's no big deal. And not, you scoundrel. He says, then neither do I condemn you. Now go and leave your life of sin. Not, your choices don't matter. Not, your choices are the only thing that matter. This tension. And so if we say God is 100% grace, we get it wrong. And if we say he's 100% truth, we get it wrong. There's this tension. We also know, don't we, that God exists outside of time? Now this, for me, I can't even think of this, but my intellectual friends are always reminding me, like, God's outside of time. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means. But it's true. In a sense, there's this like time works differently for God. I was reminded in this whole interaction of a time early when I was following Jesus, and I don't know whether someone had died who by all appearances hadn't received Christ, or someone, I don't know what the situation was, but I remember asking Fred, like, Fred, where are they? And he went, hey, Adam, you realize that like a split second for God is, 500 years for us? 2 Peter 3:8, Peter pulls on this reality. Something that even physics today is affirming. But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. And so what that tells me is that split second between physical life and death, it's a big chunk of time for God. Lots of conversation can happen in that time. I think it raises the question, do we know what transpires, what kind of business Jesus can do with somebody in the split second between life and death? You know what else? So there's things we know, and there's things we don't, I'm going to argue. And I'm going to argue to offer final proclamation upon anybody's eternal destiny is, it's operating in a sphere that we don't know everything. We know there's room for them. We don't know much beyond that. But we also know, don't we, and I think this is where it really matters, we know that the decisions we make matter, don't we? Like, listen, whether hell is a human construct or truly a revelation of God, whether hell is eternal and conscious or temporary and unconscious, whether it's God's idea or ours, isn't the fact that culture and people, that they're all talking about some version of this and asking this question, doesn't it speak to the fact that we're all somehow aware of the fact that our choices matter, that we're accountable? And you go, well, yeah, but I don't even believe in God. It doesn't mean your choices don't matter. Let me introduce you to a friend of mine who was abused by her mother, 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 and then try to tell me that your choices don't matter. Let me introduce you to this highly successful business person who was raised by a successful business person, who was raised by a successful business person, who was raised by somebody who got up and worked hard and put in the work, and try to tell me that choices don't matter. See, I think when we move off of the academic conversation, and don't get me wrong, I think there's a place for it, but in the real life, everyday grind, isn't what this is affirming is this human sense of, wait a minute, our choices matter. They translate. We're accountable for them. I was working my way through the N.T. Wright's commentary on 1 Peter. We have those back there, and some of you I know are working through some of those as well. And actually, to be honest with you, I was working through some of my own stuff this week. And I was reminded that in 1 Peter, Peter quotes from Psalm 34. And it's this kind of, oh yeah, that's a good reminder. And I couldn't help but realize, like, David in Psalm 34, he's having this same conversation. Your choices matter. Listen to this in Psalm 34. Come, my dear children, listen to me, and I'll teach you the fear of the Lord. And we go, oh, that's archaic. I'm not interested. Then he says, whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days. Okay, now I'm listening. Like, who here doesn't want to love life and have many good days? And then listen to his advice. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. Wait a minute, you mean to tell me that there's all these things like sex and alcohol and all these things you could talk to me about, and you're gonna start by watch what you say about who? Your choices matter. And it seems that David go, perhaps no choice matters more than the words you use and the things you say and don't say. What's he saying? You're accountable. Maybe not a coincidence that, 1,000 years later, a rabbi in Nazareth would say, every word you say will be a topic of conversation between you and the Lord. Why? Because the reason we go to therapy and the reason that our marriages are either good or not good, that the way our kids think about us and the way they think about how we think about them, it's all centered on our words, isn't it? They matter. He continues, turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. In other words, your virtue matters. The way you treat people, doing the right thing even when the right thing's the hard thing, it matters. And then he says, in ways that I think outside of context could become so grossly spiritualized, he says, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. Well, who are they? Oh, you mean the ones who watch their tongue? The ones who do the right thing? The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to blot out their name from the earth. Listen, I don't know how you reconcile hell, and I don't even know how important of a question that is for you. I do know that it's important when we're in conversations with people who are really considering Jesus on a deeper level. And for me, I go, that whole deal, I don't have to resolve it. It reminds and affirms to me what every person I'll ever talk to already knows. Your choices count. They're not made in isolation. They matter. And to be a Christ follower is to come alongside a living, breathing God who says, could I help you with that? Could I remind you? Could I lead you? Could I give you some self-control that you otherwise don't have? Could I change your heart? Could I help you see that you're not just talking about a feelingless individual, but a real life that matters? Listen, I think the question that I would ask you is there an area of your life where you're really wanting to believe that you're not accountable? And what happens if you continue to live that way? And what happens if you step into this idea that there is a God who is for you, not against you, and who eagerly desires to help you lead what is ultimately your life? I'd like to pray for you. God, and as I pray, boy, you're sure welcome to put it in your own words, but God, thanks, Lord, for the world that we live in and the intellectual world where we have fun conversations about things that matter on some level, but if we're not careful, miss what really matters. And God, the people in this room are here because they want a better marriage, they want to be better parents, they want to be better leaders, they want to be better business people, they want to honor you better. God, would you help us live in the conscious awareness that we stand before you? And maybe as you just sit there, you just formulate prayer in your own words in the solitude and silence of that spot. I want to take a minute with heads bowed and eyes closed to just talk to those of you who are maybe for the first time in your life awakened to what it would mean to step into a relationship with God and to live as though you're accountable to Him. Maybe you've made that decision days or weeks ago and you just want to acknowledge that now. So with everyone else's head bowed and eyes closed, would you just tell God that if that's where you're at? There's lots of ways to make that decision. What we know is you have to make a decision. You're not born a Christ follower. If there's something stirring in you and you still have questions, but you're ready to go, you're ready to follow Him, would you just tell Him that now? And with nobody looking but me, I just want to invite you to tell me. I'd love to celebrate that with you. I'd love to connect with you on that. So if you're choosing to follow Jesus, would you just be willing to look up at me and put a hand in the air a little bit so I can see you? And in doing, you're just going like, I'm doing this. You could do that now. Dude, that's incredible. Way to go. Are there others of you? Giddy up. God, you are a God of new life. And we celebrate that, God. We acknowledge that. God, would you help us to be the kind of spouse, the kind of parent, the kind of community member, the kind of employee, the kind of cultural influencer that in our best moments we want to be, but in our worst moments we forget. We sure love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.